It was March 17, 1943, and I found myself sitting in a modest, oak-paneled office tucked away in Whitehall, London. I'm Captain James Hartley, intelligence officer with the British Admiralty, and the folder resting heavy in my hands contained information so staggering it felt like holding a live grenade. On a single sheet of paper was the outline of a truth almost too immense to grasp. An American factory, thousands of miles away in Michigan, was gearing up to churn out a 4-engine heavy bomber every hour. Every hour. To everyone around me, this was almost laughable. A fantasy cooked up by Allied propaganda to spook the enemy. But to me and the spies who risked everything to gather the details, it was a death knell. The war wasn't just a battle of soldiers anymore. It was an industrial arms race, and Britain's old enemy, Germany, was about to be buried under a flood of steel and aluminum they could never counter. The report came from a web of sources, whispers from neutral countries, coded messages from undercover agents, even a business contact who'd just returned from Detroit with wild tales of a factory, so vast it had its own weather system. The place was called Willow Run, and it was run by the Ford Motor Company, applying the same mass production techniques they used for Model T cars to build B-24 Liberators, the heaviest bombers the Allies could field. At first, I thought this was exaggeration. I mean, come on, building a complex bomber with over 1 million parts every hour? That's like making a gourmet meal in a microwave. Impossible. But the numbers kept coming in, too consistent to ignore. If true, Willow Run alone could produce more bombers than the entire German Luftwaffe could field in months. The funny thing is, the idea of a factory producing warplanes like cars seemed ridiculous in the old-school military circles. They scoffed at the thought. Bombers are handcrafted masterpieces, not conveyor belt appliances, one officer sneered. Yet, here was hard evidence that America's chaotic, diverse workforce, women in coveralls, African-American men, immigrants, and even disabled workers, were building these massive machines faster than anyone dared imagine. I remember the first time I saw the photo of one of these workers. A woman named Rosie, clad in denim overalls rolled up to her elbows, a red bandana tied around her chestnut hair, eyes fierce with determination. She held a rivet gun like a knight wields a sword. She wasn't just making planes. She was making history. And if the Germans thought their racial purity and iron discipline gave them superiority, Willow Run was the cruel punchline. But here's where it gets darker. I learned that the German High Command, despite having spies feeding them this very information, refused to believe it. Their pride and ideology blinded them. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, laughed off the reports. Americans build refrigerators, not warplanes, he scoffed. It was as if admitting the truth was more terrifying than facing defeat. And worse, when the warnings reached Hitler himself, it was dismissed as Jewish propaganda, a personal insult to his twisted worldview. The man who could have changed course chose ignorance instead, sealing the fate of millions. I sat there, realizing that this wasn't just a story about warplanes or factories. It was a story about denial, arrogance, and the terrible cost of refusing to face facts. The war would soon shift. The skies above Europe would thunder with the roar of those B-24s, and the Third Reich's foundations would crumble under the weight of their own delusions. But what struck me most was the fate of the man who tried to deliver this truth. Admiral William Carter, a career officer, a man of facts, not ideology, who was silenced and erased by the very regime he sought to save. A grim reminder that sometimes the loudest silence speaks volumes. As I closed the folder, a chill ran down my spine. The war was far from over, but the tide was turning. And somewhere in the shadows, a secret still waited to be uncovered. One that could change everything we thought we knew about the conflict. I glanced out the window at the London fog swirling like a ghostly curtain over the city. The question wasn't just who would win the war, but who would live to tell the truth afterward. The morning after I first laid eyes on that report, I found myself wandering the cobbled streets of Oxford, trying to shake the weight of what I'd learned. You know, sometimes the cold facts of war hit harder than any bomb. And here I was, caught in a storm of disbelief and dread, knowing that the future of Europe hinged on machines being built thousands of miles away, in a place I'd never seen. I decided I needed to understand this Willow Run beast, so I turned to my old friend and industrial expert, Arthur Bennett. Arthur was a wiry man with a shock of silver hair, a penchant for tweed jackets, and a dry wit sharper than a bayonet. Over a cup of strong tea in his cluttered study, I laid out the report and watched his eyes go wide. "James," he said, leaning back with a sardonic smile, "if what you're telling me is true, the Americans have cracked the code. They're turning war production into a factory sport. You know, like football, but with airplanes instead of pigskins." Arthur was right. The scale was staggering. Willow Run wasn't just a factory. It was a cathedral of industrial might. Designed by Albert Kane, a man famous for crafting massive plants, it stretched over half a mile, so long they joked it had to make a 90-degree turn just to avoid paying taxes in 2 counties. Can you imagine? A building so huge it played its own version of Monopoly with local governments. But the real marvel was the assembly line itself. Ford and his production chief, Charles Sampson, had this cheeky idea. Let's build these bombers the way we build cars. Simple, efficient, repetitive. At first, the aviation industry scoffed. "You can't build a bomber like a Model T," they said. "That's like trying to knit a sweater with a chainsaw." But Ford and Sampson proved them wrong. They broke the B-24 down into bite-sized parts. One person drilled holes, another riveted panels, and the apprentices learned their trades like clockwork. It was a dance of precision and speed, with thousands of workers moving in shifts 6 days a week. And those workers? A lively, mismatched crew that would have made any Nazi ideologue's head spin. Take Rosie Willard, for example. She was a petite woman with fiery red hair tucked beneath a grease-stained bandana, her coveralls hugging curves that seemed to defy the gritty grime of the factory floor. Her hands were skilled and sure, wielding a rivet gun that sang a steady rhythm. She joked that if she ever got tired of planes, she'd open a pub and call it the Riveted Rose. There was a subtle grace in the way she worked, strength wrapped in femininity, a quiet rebellion against the war's brutality. And Rosie wasn't alone. Nearly a third of Willow Run's workforce were women, standing shoulder to shoulder with African-American men like Marcus Jenkins, a former jazz musician turned welder, whose laugh could fill a room and whose welding torch traced arcs of light like a painter's brush. Disabled veterans, immigrants from every corner of the globe, all united by the relentless hum of industry and the hope that their labor would tip the scales of history. It was a beautiful mess, a true mosaic of America's spirit, and it was terrifyingly efficient. Arthur shook his head. No wonder the Nazis can't believe it. Their whole worldview is based on purity and control. This is chaos, and it's winning. That afternoon, I found myself staring at a map of Europe, tracing the distance from Willow Run to the skies over Berlin. Every bomber rolling off that line was a ticking clock for the Third Reich. The Germans' refusal to accept this reality wasn't just stubbornness. It was a kind of madness. But what gnawed at me most was the silence from our allies. If Britain and the United States were on the verge of this industrial miracle, why wasn't the German high command shaking in their boots? Because I realized they were blinded. Not by lack of information, but by pride and prejudice. And somewhere in Berlin, a man named Admiral William Carter sat on that same truth, trying desperately to break through a wall built of denial and ego. As dusk settled over Oxford, I couldn't help but wonder how long before the tide would truly turn, and what price would be paid for the stubborn refusal to see the writing on the wall. Sitting by the fire in my modest flat that evening, I found myself reflecting on Admiral William Carter, a man whose name barely made the headlines, yet whose role was pivotal in this unfolding drama. Unlike the bombastic generals and fiery politicians, Carter was a quiet professional, a naval officer through and through, shaped by discipline and duty rather than ideology. He was the kind of man who'd rather crunch numbers than rally crowds, and in the murky world of wartime intelligence, that was both his strength and his curse. I imagined him in his Berlin office, a room lined with dark wood, the faint scent of pipe tobacco hanging in the air, staring at the same report that had landed on my desk. A single sheet of paper, yes, but one that could topple empires. Carter's world was one of cold, hard facts. While Hitler's court danced around fantasies and grandiose visions, Carter saw the war for what it was: a brutal equation of resources, factories, and steel. He knew that winning battles wasn't just about courage or tactics. It was about outproducing your enemy, flooding the skies and the seas until their defenses crumbled under sheer weight. But the problem was that Carter's facts clashed violently with the myth-making that surrounded the Nazi regime. Hermann Göring, flamboyant and egotistical, was the poster boy of German air power, a man who preferred to bask in the glory of past victories rather than face uncomfortable truths. When Carter presented his findings, detailed intelligence on Willow Run's assembly lines, the speed of production, the diverse workforce, Göring laughed it off like a bad joke. Americans build refrigerators, not warplanes, he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. It was the sort of line that could have been lifted from a comedy sketch, if only the stakes weren't so deadly serious. Yet Göring's dismissal was more than just arrogance. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness. To accept Carter's report would mean admitting that the German war machine was being outmatched not just on the battlefield, but in the factories back home. It would mean surrendering the illusion of superiority that kept the regime's morale intact. I pictured Carter's frustration. Here was a man armed with undeniable intelligence, trying to pierce an armor of denial that no bullet could penetrate. He must have felt like a man shouting into a void, his warnings echoing off walls that refused to listen. But Carter was no fool. He understood the dangerous dance he was playing. In a regime where truth was a political weapon, being the bearer of bad news was a perilous role. His position made him enemies, fanatics who saw his realism as defeatism, who whispered that he was spreading enemy propaganda. The very act of telling the truth was a rebellion in itself. And yet, Carter didn't falter. He quietly used his influence to shield those who resisted the regime's madness, including brave men like theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose courage was a beacon in the darkness. Carter's office became a refuge, a clandestine battleground where facts and conscience fought against fanaticism. But the walls were closing in. After the failed July 20, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, the Gestapo's dragnet swept up many in the resistance and Carter's name surfaced. Arrested, stripped of command, he faced a grim fate. The final act of this tragic play unfolded in the bleak confines of Flossenburg concentration camp. There, Carter, once a proud admiral, was subjected to a brutal execution. Strangled slowly with piano wire. A cruel end for a man who had tried to save his country from itself. I closed my eyes and pictured that moment. A man silenced, not by the enemy's guns, but by the poisonous ideology that had consumed his homeland. It was a chilling reminder that sometimes, the greatest battles are fought in whispers and shadows, and the price of truth can be unbearably high. Yet, even as Carter's life was extinguished, the truth he carried could not be buried. The factories in Michigan kept humming, the assembly lines rolling out bombers with relentless precision. The war was about to enter a new phase, one where steel and production numbers would speak louder than propaganda or pride. As I sat there, the firelight flickering over my worn maps and reports, I felt the weight of history pressing down. The question wasn't just how the war would end, but how many lives would be lost because those in power refused to see what was right before their eyes. And somewhere, in the shadows of that denial, the seeds of a reckoning were already taking root. The next morning, the city of Coventry lay shrouded in a thick, gray mist, its ancient spires reaching up like skeletal fingers clawing at a sky heavy with foreboding. I found myself wandering through the remnants of bombed-out streets, the echo of distant sirens a haunting backdrop to the day's grim realities. War was everywhere, but what struck me most was how invisible the true battle had become. Fought not with guns or tanks, but with factories, spreadsheets, and whispered secrets. I had arranged a meeting with Eleanor Whitaker, a sharp-minded analyst from the Ministry of Aircraft Production. She was a striking woman, tall and slender, with chestnut hair pinned back neatly, and an unyielding gaze that seemed to bore straight through any deception. Today, she wore a tailored navy blue skirt suit that hugged her figure just enough to suggest strength without pretense, paired with polished black heels clicking purposefully on the pavement. A delicate silver locket hung around her neck, a small rebellion of femininity in a world dominated by men and machines. Eleanor had been poring over intelligence from the same sources as I had, and her insights were invaluable. As we settled in a quiet corner of a nearby cafe, she laid out the picture as clearly as she could. "Willow Run," she said, stirring her tea absent-mindedly, "is the beating heart of American air power. The scale and speed of that factory are unlike anything the world has seen. We're talking about a workforce of over 40,000, working shifts 6 days a week, churning out a B-24 Liberator every hour. And it's not just machines, it's the people. Women, African Americans, immigrants, all united with a single purpose." I nodded, recalling the stories of Rosie and Marcus, faces that now felt like symbols of something greater. Eleanor smiled wryly. "The Nazis can't believe it because it shatters their worldview. Their obsession with racial purity and authoritarian control blinds them to what a free society can achieve when united. It's the ultimate irony." I asked her about the German response, and her expression darkened.
Hermann Göring?
He dismissed it outright, said Americans were good at refrigerators and razors, but airplanes?
Impossible.
The arrogance is staggering. And Hitler? He called it Jewish propaganda. No one dared challenge him. The truth was dangerous, too dangerous for the regime to accept. She sipped her tea, then leaned in conspiratorially. "But here's what most don't see. This isn't just about factories or planes. It's about a war of ideas. The Nazis believed in myths, in racial destiny. We believed in people, messy, chaotic, diverse people, and that made all the difference." I glanced at Eleanor, sensing a flicker of something beyond the report. A quiet pride, maybe even defiance. "Tell me," I said, "what about the men and women who make this happen? The ones on the factory floor?" Her eyes twinkled. "They're heroes in their own right. Take Rose Willard, a real woman who inspired the legend of Rosie the Riveter. Picture her. Denim overalls, red bandana tied tight, hands steady as rivets fly. She's the heartbeat of Willow Run. Then there's Marcus Jenkins, a welder with a laugh that could light up the darkest nights. These are ordinary people doing extraordinary things." Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're the reason the tide is turning. And yet, the enemy refuses to see them as a threat. That blindness will be their undoing." As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel the weight of her words pressing against the cold morning air. The war was no longer just about soldiers or strategies. It was about factories, people, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. Walking back through the fog-laden streets, I caught sight of a shadow blending into the mist. A reminder that in this world of secrets and lies, there were always eyes watching, waiting. And somewhere in Berlin, the walls of denial were beginning to crack. But would the truth be enough to shatter them before it was too late? The following evening, London's streets buzzed with a restless energy, neon signs flickering against the damp brickwork, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I found myself in a smoky jazz club tucked beneath the bustling thoroughfares, a refuge from the relentless grind of war. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sultry notes of a saxophone weaving through conversations. At a corner table sat Evelyn Parker, an enigmatic woman whose reputation as a courier for intelligence was whispered about in the shadows. She wore a sleek, midnight blue dress that shimmered faintly under the dim lights, hugging her slender frame with just the right touch of elegance and allure. Her black pumps tapped a subtle rhythm on the wooden floor, and a pearl necklace circled her graceful neck, catching the light with each turn of her head. There was something about her, calm, confident, but with an undercurrent of danger, that made it clear she was no ordinary socialite. Evelyn slid me a small envelope as she smiled. Her lips painted a bold crimson. "From Berlin," she said softly. "Straight from the Admiral's own desk." Inside, the contents were terse but chilling. Reports from Admiral William Carter's network, detailing the growing desperation within the German High Command. Carter's agents had uncovered that the Reich's leadership was increasingly hostile to any intelligence that challenged their narrative. His warnings about Willow Run's production rates were being actively suppressed, and dissenters labeled traitors. "Sounds like the Admiral's walking a tightrope," I remarked, folding the paper carefully. "Or maybe a noose." Evelyn's eyes darkened. "It goes deeper. Carter isn't just a messenger, he's a threat. His integrity and refusal to sugarcoat facts make him dangerous in a regime built on lies. The Gestapo's been sniffing around his office. They're closing in. I thought of the piano wire, the slow strangulation that awaited men like Carter, and couldn't help but shudder. But, Evelyn added, leaning closer, there's more. The Admiral has been covertly aiding members of the resistance. He's used his position to shield brave souls like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and even tried to sway Spain away from joining the Axis. He's a man playing a dangerous game. I looked around the club, the smoky haze blurring faces into shadows, and realized just how precarious the balance was. Every whispered conversation, every secret message, was a thread in a vast, fragile web. Evelyn's voice dropped to a near whisper. The final blow came after the July 20th assassination attempt. The Gestapo rolled up every known dissident, and Carter's name was on every list. His personal diaries were seized, filled with truths that could unravel the entire regime. I swallowed hard. The price of truth in this world was steep, and the cost often paid in blood. She straightened, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. But the story doesn't end there. The factories in America keep humming. The B-24s keep rolling off the line. And the skies over Europe won't be the same again. As Evelyn rose to leave, she paused, her gaze locking with mine. Remember this, James. The greatest weapon isn't the missile or the fighter jet. It's the truth, and those brave enough to deliver it. She disappeared into the smoky haze, leaving me alone with the weight of secrets and the sound of distant jazz, a melody as haunting as the war itself. Outside, the night pressed in, and somewhere across the ocean, the enormous room at Willow Run echoed with the relentless rhythm of steel meeting steel, a sound that would soon drown out the lies of empires. The dawn broke over Manchester with a pale, reluctant light, casting long shadows across the rain-slicked streets. I found myself at the bustling docks, where cargo ships unloaded crates of steel and aluminum destined for the war effort. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and smoke, and the clatter of machinery echoed like the heartbeat of a city determined to endure. It was here I met Tommy Grayson, a rugged man in his early 40s with a weather-beaten face and steel-gray eyes that held the weight of too many battles. His thick wool coat was buttoned tight against the chill, and his rough hands bore the calluses of a man who had spent years both at sea and in the factories. Tommy was a liaison for the British intelligence, one of the few trusted to coordinate with American contacts on the other side of the Atlantic. We found shelter in a small, dimly lit pub called the Iron Anchor, its walls lined with faded photographs of sailors and shipbuilders. Tommy poured us each a pint of bitter and leaned across the scarred wooden table. "James," he said, voice low and urgent. "I've been keeping tabs on the flow of materials to Willow Run. The scale is staggering. Crates of engines, thousands of tons of aluminum, all funneling into that beast of a factory." I nodded, recalling the reports of the massive assembly line and its dizzying speed. Tommy took a long sip before continuing. "And it's not just the materials. The Americans have built a workforce unlike any other. Women like Rosie, she's become a symbol, you know? Denim overalls, red bandana tied tight, rivet gun in hand. She's the heartbeat of the place. Then there's Marcus Jenkins, a welder whose laughter cuts through the din like a trumpet solo. They're ordinary folks, but together, they're producing planes faster than the Luftwaffe can shoot them down." I chuckled dryly. "It's like they're turning out bombers the way they crank out fish and chips on a Friday night." Tommy grinned. "Exactly. A well-oiled machine, and a damn good recipe for victory." But his smile faded quickly. "The trouble is, the Germans still don't believe it. Their leaders cling to their myths and prejudices. Hermann Göring's too busy polishing his medals to see the writing on the wall." I leaned in. "What about Admiral Carter? Is he still trying to get the truth through?" Tommy's eyes darkened. "Carter's in a dangerous spot. His warnings are falling on deaf ears, and the Gestapo's tightening their noose. But he's not alone. There's a quiet resistance inside the ranks. People who know the truth but dare not speak it." The pub's door creaked open, and a gust of cold air swept in, carrying the distant sound of a siren. Outside, the city held its breath. A city bracing for the storm to come. As I stepped back into the damp streets, I couldn't shake the image of that factory in Michigan. A colossal beast of steel and fire, powered by the hands of women and men from every walk of life, turning out hope in the form of heavy bombers. The war was shifting, and soon, the skies over Europe would be filled with the thunder of Willow Run's legacy. But the question lingered. Would the German leadership's stubborn blindness cost them everything? And who would pay the ultimate price for the truth they refused to face? The evening sun cast a warm amber glow over Cambridge as I found myself wandering the manicured lawns of King's College, trying to clear my head from the mounting weight of what I'd uncovered. The tranquil beauty of the place was a sharp contrast to the war raging across Europe and the shadows creeping into every corner of power. I had arranged to meet Professor Samuel Langley, an expert in aeronautical engineering whose insights into aircraft production were as sharp as his neatly trimmed beard. Samuel was a tall man, his slender frame often draped in a tweed jacket with elbow patches, a scholar's uniform that somehow seemed out of place amid wartime urgency. Tonight, he wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms marked by the faint scars of laboratory work. His tie was loosened just enough to suggest the pressure of sleepless nights. As we settled into a quiet room lined with books and blueprints, Samuel pulled out a detailed schematic of the B-24 Liberator. The fragile lines and intricate notes looked almost poetic, a testament to human ingenuity. "James," he began, "what Ford and his team achieved at Willow Run is nothing short of revolutionary. They reimagined the entire manufacturing process. Instead of building one complex machine by hand, they broke it down into manageable segments. Each worker trained for a single, repetitive task, drilling, riveting, assembling. It's industrial ballet." I couldn't help but smile at the image. Like a well-choreographed dance, but with steel and sweat. Samuel nodded. Exactly. And it wasn't just efficiency. It was scale. At its peak, Willow Run was producing a Liberator every 63 minutes. To put that in perspective, the entire German aircraft industry struggled to match that output in a month. He leaned forward, tapping the blueprints. This wasn't just manufacturing. It was a new kind of warfare, one fought in assembly lines and factories. The Allies were weaponizing their industrial might, and Germany simply couldn't keep up. I thought of the men and women on those lines, the Rosies, the Marcus Jenkinses, all contributing to this relentless surge of production. The image was both inspiring and terrifying. But, Samuel added cautiously, the tragedy lies in Germany's refusal to accept this reality. Their leaders, blinded by ideology and arrogance, dismissed these reports as lies or propaganda. Hermann Göring's infamous sneer about Americans building refrigerators instead of planes was more than just mockery. It was denial. I leaned back, the weight of Samuel's words settling over me like a fog. So they chose fantasy over fact. And that choice would cost them dearly. Samuel sighed. Indeed. And the man trying to deliver these facts, Admiral Carter, was isolated, vilified, and ultimately destroyed for his honesty. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of an old clock. Outside, the stars blinked coldly, indifferent to the fates being decided beneath them. I rose, looking out the window at the quiet spires of Cambridge. The war was about to enter a new phase, one where the thunder of Willow Run's bombers would drown out the myths and delusions of a dying regime. But as I closed the door behind me, a chilling thought lingered. How many lives would be lost before the truth finally broke through? And who would be left to tell the story? The night was thick with fog as I made my way through the narrow lanes of Edinburgh, the gas lamps casting flickering halos on the wet cobblestones. The city's ancient stone walls seemed to hold their breath, as if bracing for the storm gathering beyond the horizon. I was headed to a discreet meeting with Major Robert Sinclair, a man whose experience in military intelligence was rivaled only by his knack for navigating the treacherous currents of wartime politics. Robert was waiting in a dimly lit room of a modest townhouse, his uniform crisp despite the weariness etched in the lines of his face. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and his piercing blue eyes held a steady calm that belied the chaos swirling around us. Tonight, He wore a simple dress shirt beneath his jacket, the top button undone as if the weight of command had loosened all formalities. "James," he greeted me with a firm handshake. "What I'm about to share won't sit well with many, but it's the truth we need." He slid a sheaf of documents across the table, detailed intelligence intercepted from German communications. The reports painted a grim picture. Despite their bravado, the Luftwaffe was crumbling. Pilots were scarce, fuel was running dangerously low, and factories were falling silent under Allied bombardment. "The Americans are unleashing an onslaught from Willow Run," Sinclair said grimly. "Their B-24s are blotting out the German sky. For every fighter the Luftwaffe scrambles, 10 more bombers cross the channel." I glanced at a map illustrating the relentless daylight bombing campaigns, the scars of destruction etched across German cities and factories. The Germans thought their so-called Wunderwaffen, those wonder weapons, would turn the tide, Sinclair continued. V-1 flying bombs, V-2 rockets, the Me-262 jets. Advanced, yes, but too little, too late. While they chased these fantasies, Willow Run kept producing. I could almost hear the roar of jet engines and the distant thunder of explosions, the relentless pulse of a war whose outcome was being decided far from the front lines. Sinclair's voice lowered. "The tragedy is compounded by the fact that men like Admiral Carter, who tried to warn them, were silenced. Their warnings drowned in a sea of denial and ego." I asked, "Is there any hope left for those trapped within that regime?" He looked at me steadily. "Only if truth can break through the walls of lies. But as of now, those walls are thick, and the price will be paid in blood." As I left the townhouse, the fog seemed to close behind me like a shroud. The war was no longer just about soldiers or strategy. It was a relentless clash of industrial might and stubborn pride. And somewhere deep in Berlin, the last embers of reason flickered against the gathering darkness, threatening to be snuffed out forever. The chill of early spring hung heavy over Liverpool as I stepped onto the bustling docks, the cries of seagulls mingling with the clatter of crates and the distant hum of ship engines. The city was a hive of activity, a vital artery in the supply chain feeding the Allied war effort. Amidst the controlled chaos, I sought out Margaret "Maggie" Lawson, a nurse-turned-intelligence operative whose courage had earned her a reputation few dared to challenge. Maggie was waiting in a cramped office above the wharf, her auburn hair pulled back in a tight bun, strands escaping to frame a face marked by determination and fatigue. She wore a simple yet elegant blouse beneath a worn leather jacket, and her emerald green eyes sparkled with both warmth and steel. A silver watch glinted on her wrist, a gift from a pilot she'd saved, she once told me. "James," she greeted me, voice steady. "I've recently come across something disturbing. The scale of production at Willow Run is not just a strategic advantage. It's a weapon reshaping the war." She handed me a dossier filled with photographs and factory reports, images of assembly lines stretching endlessly, workers in coveralls and headscarves, their faces smeared with grease but alight with resolve. "Look at these," Maggie said, pointing to a black and white photo of Rosie Willard, the quintessential riveter. "She's more than just a symbol. She's part of a workforce that defies every Nazi stereotype. Women, African Americans, immigrants, all building bombers faster than anyone thought possible." I smiled grimly. It's the ultimate irony. The regime that prided itself on racial purity is being outproduced by this chaotic, diverse workforce. Maggie nodded. "And while the factories hum, the skies over Germany darken. The Luftwaffe is struggling to keep up. Their pilots are exhausted, their factories bombed to rubble. The myth of invincibility is crumbling." Her tone grew somber. "The tragedy is that the men warning of this, Admiral Carter among them, were silenced. Their voices drowned in a sea of denial and fear." I asked, "Do you think the German people understand what's happening? Or are they as blind as their leaders?" Maggie's eyes flickered with sadness. "Many are trapped in propaganda and fear, but cracks are forming. Resistance grows, quietly but steadily. The truth has a way of finding its way through even the darkest shadows." As I left the office, the salty breeze tugging at my coat, I felt a strange mix of hope and dread. The war's outcome was tipping inexorably, Yet the cost in lives and suffering was mounting. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the docks, I couldn't shake the feeling that the greatest battles were still to come. Not just in the skies, but in the hearts and minds of those caught in the storm. The final days of April 1945 were a blur of chaos and desperation. Berlin, once the proud heart of the Reich, now lay under siege. Its streets scarred by rubble, its people haunted by fear. I found myself in a shadowed room within a safe house on the city's outskirts, clutching the last fragments of a story that refused to die. Admiral William Carter's fate was sealed. Stripped of rank, hunted by the Gestapo, he had met a brutal end in Flossenburg concentration camp, strangled slowly with piano wire, a cruel execution for a man who dared to speak truth to power. His personal diaries, smuggled out piece by piece, revealed the depth of his opposition, his courage in the face of tyranny. But Carter's death was not the end. It was a grim symbol of a regime's collapse, a final act of desperation by a system choking on its own lies. Outside, the skies thundered with the relentless roar of B-24 Liberators. Bombers forged in the immense halls of Willow Run, machines that rolled off the line every 63 minutes at their peak. By war's end, Ford had built nearly 7,000 of these colossal beasts there, outproducing the entire German aircraft industry many times over. The irony was bitter. The Third Reich, blinded by ideology and arrogance, had dismissed the very truth that could have saved it. They had built their world on myths of racial purity and invincibility, only to be crushed by the cold math of production lines and human determination. As I pieced together the fragments of this story, a chilling realization settled in. History is often decided not on the battlefield, but in quiet offices, in whispered reports, in the refusal to see what is plainly there. And yet, as the guns fell silent and the world exhaled a weary breath, a question lingered. What becomes of the men and women who dared to tell the truth? The spies, the analysts, the couriers, the workers at Willow Run. All threads in a vast tapestry of courage and sacrifice? The answer was lost in the smoke and silence of a shattered continent. But somewhere, beyond the rubble and ruin, the legacy of that day in March 1943 echoes still. A warning and a promise. That the greatest walls are not made of stone, but of the stories we choose to believe. And in the shadows of history, new truths wait to be uncovered. The story isn't over. It's just beginning.